minutes. And just so everyone knows, we are being live streamed tonight. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes. I want to welcome everyone to this meeting for the Forest Knolls, Montgomery Knolls, and Pinecrest Boundary Study. Second meeting in this series presenting the first set of options. Tonight we'll review the Board of Education approved resolution, policy factors. Some of this is review, things that we reviewed at the first meeting if you were here. The guiding parameters for option development, current information, the presentation of options, then we'll have some questions and answers followed by the next steps. Now, as you came in, you were given 3x5 cards. If you have any questions, you can write them down on those 3x5 cards. If you have a question ready, you can raise your hand, and either DJ in the back or Julie will come around and pick them up, and then we'll answer them when the time comes. DJ also has extra cards in case you use one and have another question. You can, again, raise your hand, and he'll come over. I do want to thank the extra planning staff that's here tonight. We have DJ Connolly and Julie over there. So we start, why are we here in the first place? There was actually a capacity study for the three schools back in 2014-15. At that time, it was determined that additional capacity was needed among the three schools, and it was determined that the best place to put that capacity were in Montgomery Knolls and in Pinecrest. So this November, the board passed a resolution saying go ahead and do the boundary study to allow for students from Forest Knolls to be moved into Pinecrest and Montgomery Knolls. In addition to including the three Forest Knolls, Montgomery Knolls, and Pinecrest, they directed staff to also look at what would happen if similar changes in boundaries were made at the middle school level. So that's why Eastern and Sims are included in this study. So policy FAA is one that guides staff into how to do the planning for this process. And there are several factors that are listed that staff should consider while creating a range of options. These policies include, or these factors include, the demographic characteristics of student populations. These include not only race and ethnicity, but factors such as free and reduced meals, as well as ESOL, percentage of ESOL in each of the schools and areas. Geography is included, so options should take into account the geographic proximity of communities to schools, as well as articulation, traffic, transportation patterns, and topography. For clarification on articulation, that's schools that feed into other schools. So in this case, we've got actually an extra layer. We've got Montgomery Knolls that feeds into Pinecrest, that then feeds into the middle school. And then we've got Forest Knolls feeding into its middle school currently. This next factor, stability of school assignment over time, this one actually isn't being considered in this boundary study, and that's because there have been no boundary studies in this area for a long time. So no student that's involved in this boundary study would have been involved in any other boundary study previously. So it's listed as one of the 4 factors, but it's not one that we are using in this boundary study. And then facility utilization, which is the ratio of students in a building to the capacity of that building. Typically, we'd like to see, ideally, somewhere around 80 to 100% utilization of a building. In some cases, that may mean that you need to split the geography such that you need to send kids in multiple clusters. And that plans should be fiscally responsible. So an extreme example is you wouldn't put everyone into one building and then require the doubling of the size of that building if there are adjacent buildings that can accommodate some of those students. So the parameters for the option development, in this case, as I mentioned, we're only going to look at 3 of the factors: the demographic characteristics of student population, geography, and facility utilization. We also try to maintain walkers as best as we can. And in this case, we know that the standard grandfathering would apply, so that's the rising 5th graders when it goes into effect would remain at Forest Knolls. So a review of the current information is a map of the study area. We also have a hard copy of a similar map to the side that also indicates the walk zones. But here we've broken the geography into multiple zones. The walk zone for Forest Knolls, the walk zone for Pinecrest, the walk zone for Montgomery Knolls, and then smaller pieces of geography around those zones that we looked at when we were creating the options. So when we have a series of these effects tables that show the current enrollment followed by the projections from next year out to 24-25 school year. And it shows how this need was determined. If you look at Forest Knolls, the program capacity for Forest Knolls is at 529. Yet their enrollment is already at 718 and is projected to increase to 775 in 24-25 if no boundary changes were implemented. In Montgomery Knolls, the program capacity is currently 537. However, because of the project, the addition that's going on there, the capacity will increase to 681. The enrollment there is currently around 490 students and actually projected to decrease slightly to 468 in the out year. In Pinecrest, the capacity, again, currently is at 404, but is projected to be up to 634 based on the addition that's being constructed there. The enrollment at Pinecrest is projected to go up to 493 students, leaving about 141 students. So between Montgomery Knolls, their excess capacity of 213, and Pinecrest excess capacity of 141, that more than enough covers the needs of the overcapacity, overutilization at Forest Knolls. At Eastern, actually at both of the middle schools, currently they're each projected to have about 50 seats available in the out year. There is an addition, a project going on at Silver Springs International that will increase its capacity up to 1298, coming online in the 22-23 school year. At the last series of meetings, we had some questions regarding the playgrounds for the Pinecrest and Montgomery Knolls. So we brought in a couple of slides just to indicate that, yes, there are planned playgrounds at both of those schools. They may currently be doing something slightly different during construction because of staging areas. But at Montgomery Knolls, for example, we have, and they may be slightly different to this, but the preliminary concept indicated that there was going to be a play field, a hard surface play area, as well as two playground equipment areas. Generally, they're broken down into age groups, so one geared towards younger students and one geared towards slightly older students. And at Pinecrest, similarly, there's an addition planned there, but the playground and hard paved play area are also represented here as approximate to what they're planning. And from what I understand, they are planning very nice playgrounds at both of the schools. So now we'll go into the options. Now, just for reference, all of these presentations are available on the website, so if you didn't get a copy or want to look at it in your phone and see something a little more clear, you can do it that way as well, or at home on the computer or whatever.
What website?
I will have that at the very end of the presentation. The website will be there. But it is the planning department's, capital planning department's website. And actually, if you Google boundary studies, Montgomery County Public Schools, you can find it that way as well. So we have option one, and I wanted to show the map. The map is all the way over there. So in option one, and there is a map 3 pages in if you're following along, we look at areas or zones 3 and 4, F3 and F4. So that would be from Forest Knolls to Montgomery Knolls, Pinecrest. And by doing this, when you read across, the first year of implementation is in 2020, 2021. Remember that in that year, a rising fifth grader would remain at Forest Knolls. So in the first year of implementation, it would be kindergarten through fourth graders who would be moved from Forest Knolls to Montgomery Knolls or Pinecrest, depending on their grades. So the number of students, if you look at no change, that's if no boundary changes were made. Again, we looked at that and they would be at a deficit of 246 at Forest Knolls. With the change of moving zones F3 and F4, Forest Knolls would get to within 30 of their capacity, so a deficit of minus 29 in the out year, so 2024, 25. Montgomery Knolls would go from a surplus of 213 seats to a surplus of only 116 seats, so 83% utilization of that building. And Pinecrest would go from a surplus of 141 or 78% utilization to a surplus of only 21 students, or essentially at capacity at 97%. Now, adjacent to those capacity and utilization numbers are the demographic, the race, ethnic, and farms and ESOL data numbers. So what you see here are the proportions and how they change. So, for example, the farms data at Forest Knolls would be changed from 30.1% D4, that's what their current number would be, and with the change, it's 34.1%. Now, it's important to note that we don't actually project the race, ethnic, or farms and ESOL data. That's what would happen if you made this change today with current students. But it gives you an idea of what it might do, thank you. For Montgomery Knolls, reading it down, it would drop the farms from 58.8% to 52.8%. And for Pinecrest, it would go from 47.4% to 42.7%. Now, the following page is the Eastern and Sims numbers, again, reading them the same way. In the middle schools, they currently have, as we said before, about 50 seats available in the out year for both of them. At Sims, it's because there's an addition coming that will increase their space available, cover their deficit. With a change, if there were to be a change at the middle school that would mimic the geography that's being changed at the elementary school, you then end up with a deficit at Eastern of 84 students, or a utilization of 108% in the out year. At Silver Spring International, you'd end up with a surplus of 182 seats, or a utilization of 86% in the out year. Again, looking at the farms data, I'm not reading every single piece of information here because there will be a lot of repetition, but just looking at the farms data as an example, the percent of farms at Eastern would go from 49.8% to 47.6% if a change were made. There would be a slight increase at Silver Spring International from 38.3% to 40% for farms. The next chart applies to all three options, and it's when we talked about articulation from elementary to middle and then middle to high school. The current situation is straight articulation for each of these schools. So Forest Knolls feeds directly into Silver Spring International, which then feeds into Northwood High School. And then Montgomery Knolls Pinecrest feeds into Eastern, which feeds into Blair. With this boundary change, there's no plan on making any change at the high school level. So there would be a split articulation. If nothing were done at the middle school, if you just did a change at the elementary school, there would be a split articulation from elementary to middle. Meaning that students from Montgomery, Knolls, Pinecrest could feed, depending on where they lived, into either Silver Springs International or into Eastern. Now, if there is a change at the middle school assignment, and that would be to, again, reflect the geography that's being moved at the elementary level to make it match at the middle school level, you would then actually have a split articulation. They would feed into Eastern, but then Eastern would fit, I'm going to get this right, into Blair and into Northwood. So the map for option 1, these are the zones that we referred to before. So these are zone 3s and zone 3 and zone 4, F3 and F4. For option 2, sorry. They would go to Montgomery, Knolls, and Pinecrest, depending on where they fall in grade-wise. So,
Is there a breakdown on how they go into Pinecrest and Montgomery Knolls?
yes, it's in the chart. But if you have questions, if you could write them down, and then we'll answer those. So to read this map, the hatched area is the area that's being considered to be moved from one area to the next. So that hatched area is currently Forest Knolls, and the proposal, it's to be moved into Pinecrest or Montgomery Knolls. So in option 2, we're looking at zones F2, F3, and F5. And for this one, this option, in the out year in 24-25, Forest Knolls ends up with essentially at capacity. It's with a deficit of 10 students, which over 6 grades is 1 per grade. It's not too bad. Montgomery Knolls ends up with a surplus of 110 or 84% utilization. Pinecrest ends up essentially at capacity at 99%. There's a slight increase of farms from 30.1% to 31.9% at Forest Knolls. Again, a decrease at Montgomery Knolls from 59.3% to 52.5%. Pinecrest from 47.4% to 44.6%. At the middle school, similar to the other option, we end up with a deficit at Eastern, this time at 94 or 109% of utilization, and a surplus at Silver Springs International at 85% or 192. And the difference between this one and the other one for East Holland Farms are pretty similar. It should be noted that the larger the school, the larger the school, larger the population, these changes don't mean as much because the proportions are not as big. So in the map for option 2, we see this sort of pinch point, but you have F5, which is sort of the top of the tail, an F2 underneath it, and then F3 being the one adjacent to Pinecrest. Again, the area that we're considering in this option are the hatched areas. And they're all from Forest Knolls into Montgomery Knolls and Pinecrest. As I said before, the articulation chart would remain the same for each one. So in option F3, or option 3, we're looking at zones F2 and F4. Yes, all right. In this option, Forest Knolls ends up with a slight surplus of 36 in the out year. And Montgomery Knolls ends up with a surplus of 85 students, or 88% utilized. And Pinecrest ends up a little over capacity at negative 13, or 102% utilization. Our farms numbers change from the 31.1% at Forest Knolls to start to 32.5%. Montgomery Knolls changes from 58.8 to 51.8, and Pinecrest from 47.4 down to 43.2. So at the middle school level, what happens is in the out year in 24-25, Eastern ends up with a deficit of 75, or it's 107% utilized. Sims ends up with a surplus of 173, or 87%. And again, slight changes at the farms level from 49.5% to 47.4% at Eastern, from 38.3% at Sims to 40% at Sims. Looking at the map, you can see the zones that we're talking about. Again, the hatched pattern indicating where which pieces of geography we're considering moving in this option. If you have questions, now is a good time to raise your card so that people can come around and pick them up, and we'll start answering those in a minute. So I will, before finishing the meeting, obviously we will go through the questions and answers, but I do want to say everyone should have received a pink sheet, and we'd appreciate it if you could fill those out, and we'll get those collected at the end of the meeting. There will be a survey posted by the end of the week, and if anyone has paid any attention to the up-county survey or the up-county process, boundary process, we've done a survey there as well. So following a similar outreach process, we will post a survey for responses later this week. The next rounds of meetings will have Montgomery Knolls on May 20th, and Forest Knolls May 21st. And here's the website that people were asking about before. And then in a minute, I will gather some of these questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. All right. Okay, thanks. There's some more. Okay, so the question is, what if you live along the dividing line? And the fact is that everyone is placed into a school boundary, so you won't live right on the line. You will live on one side of the line or the other. And do you get any choice? No, the boundary process will establish what your base school is, what your boundary is, what school assignments you have. There's a separate process called change of school assignment. It's called COSA for short. And you can go online and look at the COSA process. There's specific requirements to try to get placed into a school that's not what your official assignment is. I'm not sure I understand the.
If the line goes down a street in the map, is the proposal for which to react to it? Is the proposal that you're in F5 or F2 or?
Okay, so there is an interactive map. This is a good question. So generally, the boundaries are drawn either down a street center line or they're drawn on a stream valley. Sometimes they're drawn at the back of lot lines. So yes, these are high-level maps, so you can't drill down to see whether your property is one side or the other. But if it's down a street, then essentially that's the street center line, and those on one side of the street would go to one, and the other side would go to the other. There is an interactive map that, if it isn't posted, will be posted by the end of the week. Where you can actually type in your address and then look at how your address specifically is affected by the different options. What is the southern portion of Zone 2? So F4 is actually bound by 495 to the south, by University Boulevard to the north, Dennis Avenue to the northwest, and then it goes between Portland and Renfrew. It goes between, so it actually takes rear lot lines at that point. And afterwards, you're welcome to look at the walk zone map to get a better feel for how those zones are drawn. Thank you. So this question, why are there no options to keep all current students back to the middle schools at Sims, not Eastern? That's one, there's several questions here. That's one of the questions. So the board resolution asks that staff look at what happens if you do that. That does not mean that the board will vote on both of them together. They may very well say, we want to do an elementary boundary change, but have decided not to do the middle school change. The superintendent could recommend one of the options, or he may make a modification to put forward to the board. So there are several, what we're looking at now are staff-developed options, but that could change between, what the staff develops and what the superintendent ultimately puts forth, and ultimately it's the board that makes the decision. So it could be that they decide not to do the middle school option, but we were asked to look at it. Are the grandfathered fifth graders also grandfathered to the middle schools? I don't have that answer, but that's one that we can look into. That, again, ultimately is the board that makes the decision on grandfathering. The superintendent, again, may make a recommendation. The rising fifth graders to finish off where they start, that's generally how that's done. So it's usually just to finish out the current school, not for the middle schools. So do any of the options change Title I or focus status? So those cutoffs can be different year to year, so I can't actually answer that question. That being said, the changes in percentages aren't substantial. So it's possible that they could remain focus schools regardless. What year would these changes go into effect? They are to go into effect for the 2021 school year. So they'll be voted on in November of 19 and go into effect the following year. So it's asking, is F3 and F4 would go to Pinecrest or Montgomery Knolls? That's based on the grade configuration. So Montgomery Knolls is a pre-K through second grade, and Pinecrest is third through fifth. If your boundary changes when your student is in sixth grade, will they have to change middle schools? So if there's a middle school boundary change, just as in the elementary level, they only grandfather the rising fifth graders, in the middle school, they would tend to only grandfather the rising eighth graders. So yes, it is possible that if you had a sixth grader, they would end up switching. So why go through all of this and still leave Forest Knolls overcapacity as in option 1? So we look at a range of options, and we look at how they might work with geography, the geography factor versus the utilization factor versus the demographic factor. Sometimes boundary options do a good job of 2 of the 3 factors. Sometimes they will do well with all 3. Sometimes they'll only do well with 1. So in option 1, they leave Forest Knolls slightly over capacity. As I said, it's we'll actually be looking at projections, upgrading or updating the projections in a few months when we get the new enrollment data. It's actually done every year. At that time, if the numbers significantly change, if it looks like projections are going to skew upward or downward, there may be changes in what gets put forward. Option 3, the southern portion of zone F2. So that's actually earlier, an earlier definition. So the southern portion of F2 is actually F2. We changed the northern portion to F5. So we'll make a change of that, and in the presentation we'll post an update to that. And as far as So there are a couple of institutional buildings. I believe it's a private school, and the boundary line between the southern F2 and F5 is on the southern portion of that school. If that helps. If Eastern ends up overutilized, will there be an addition project there? So it depends on what the trigger, well, it has to, I believe, get to 150 to trigger an addition. So none of these options actually reach that trigger point. So it may be that there could be portables, or there may be some other way to deal with that overcapacity, overutilization. What percentage of Farms ESOL students qualify for a school for Focus End or Title I funding? As I said, that number, I believe, changes year to year. So I can't give an exact cutoff. But I can do some research to see, or we can do some research to see what that might be. Thanks. How does the redistricting affect students who attend Forest Knolls via COSA? So change of school assignment is different because you're not attending a school that for which you are in boundary. So because of that, you're not affected by the boundary change. That being said, they may, in the COSA office, change who's allowed in to a building based on overcapacity, undercapacity, that sort of thing. There's usually a hardship required. There is a hardship required to be approved for a COSA. So redistricting by itself doesn't affect those families because they're not there because they're in that district, if that makes sense. If there's a change in middle school assignment, will it affect students already in middle school? And I answered that earlier. So it would be generally it's the rising 8th graders who get to stay at the middle school and the 6th and 7th graders who need to move with that assignment. If Sims is under-enrolled and Eastern is over-enrolled in upcoming years, why would you move? Again, the reason that it's put forward is because staff was asked to look at it to see if a straight articulation from elementary to middle made sense. It may very well be that it's preferable, even though there'll no longer be straight articulation elementary, middle, and high, to be split articulated from elementary to middle and then go on to their respective high schools. What is the preferred option from your analysis so far? So as staff, we don't have a preferred option. We were asked to produce a range of options. And so we looked at the pieces of geography that made sense, and we looked at a variety of permutations and have presented what those permutations would do as far as enrollment. The second part of this is, can a zone be changed for elementary but not changed for middle school? As I indicated earlier, yes, it is very possible that the superintendent will look at what these results are and decide to go forward with one of the options at the elementary, possibly no option at the middle school, or come up with some alternate altogether. And what the superintendent puts forward as a recommendation doesn't necessarily mean what will, the board could decide to do something else entirely, or they could take one of the options or the superintendent's option. Is there a real possibility to choose an option for elementary and not choose? Again, it's the same sort of question. So a lot of people are concerned, and I understand, the numbers are not logical to do it that way, but it is something we were asked to look at. CES students. So this question I don't actually have the answer to, so I'll have to set that aside. So the question it has to do, and it has to do with special needs students, so I would be hesitant to answer that anyway. And it has to do with sharing, special needs student classes with the non-special needs students. So that's not a question that we're addressing tonight. Will rising second graders have to attend different schools in 3 different years? Possibly. It depends on what whether or not they will do some sort of special grandfathering. But if they decide to grandfather rising second graders, they would still have to move at the 3rd grade level, so it would just delay it 1 year, and then they would end up going to Pinecrest, from Forest Knolls to Pinecrest. So you may, as a parent, it may keep them with their Forest Knolls peers for 1 extra year, but then they're getting 1 less year to make friends with kids they would then ultimately be going on with. So the answer to that is, currently we're just grandfathering the 5th graders, so that's the standard protocol. This is a sort of a special case, so the superintendent may make another recommendation. So this one has to do with, again, grandfathered 5th graders and whether or not they get into the middle school of choice. So there's still, because they're consortium schools, you'll still have that. It's just the base school would be different. So that's the only thing that would change there. You would still be a consortium school. How does the current countywide boundary assessment affect this assessment? So the current boundary, the all-county boundary-wide assessment is an assessment, not a boundary study. That sounds like semantics, but there are actually 2 separate processes. This one was initiated by a resolution that I showed at the very beginning of the process, very specific because there were additions being built to the 2 elementary, Montgomery, Knolls, and Pinecrest, to relieve specifically the crowding at Forest Knolls. So the board has directed this process to continue. The countywide boundary study assessment is a completely different animal. When is the next boundary study anticipated? So when is the next boundary study anticipated? 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years? I can't answer that. It all depends on, and it's something that is looked at every year when we do enrollment projections and utilization analysis, and if it looks as if all of a sudden there's a huge amount of growth in one school that requires a redistricting, then there's this very formal process of a resolution has to be passed by the board, directing staff to do the boundary study. Then there's this, year-and-a-half process of meetings, et cetera. So the idea here was this, started back in 2014-15, showing that there was a need in the area, and through both capital improvements and this boundary process, the hope is to relieve the crowding in all the schools involved in the study. Is it possible to look up specific addresses online with the posted maps? So not with the PowerPoint, but yes, with the interactive map. So with the interactive map, you will be able to input a specific address, and it should be able to pull that up, and then click on the various options to see if it's included in one or more of the options. That one I already answered. Will Montgomery, Knolls, and Pinecrest offer the same aftercare programs as Forest Knolls has? I don't have an answer to that, but I'm sure that there are after-school programs. I just don't know whether they will be the same. And that's something that the leadership, we can look into, but it's not driven by this process. That's something else entirely. What is the process for selecting the options? So staff will review the options with the superintendent, but it's ultimately the superintendent will put up an option, whether it's one of the staff developed options or something modified, to the Board of Education. Ultimately, it is the Board of Education who will vote to either choose one of these options or ask for an alternative and vote on an alternative. There is the survey will allow you to rank your favorite option. It will have you rank your first, second, and third choice, as well as which factors you believe are most relevant, and which options you believe advance which factors the best. What type of feedback do you anticipate getting that would change options before the next meeting? So this is a good question. In this, I'll use the example of the Upper County boundary change or boundary study options. There are currently 14 options that are being looked at up there. Granted, it's a much larger study, 3 high school clusters and all their feeding schools. This is a much smaller study and much smaller geography that we're considering. Where the zones were created or how the zones were created, the intent is not to split communities at such a small level that those boundaries don't make sense. So in as much as we can use a major road or a stream valley or a park, something that's easily enough identifiable, that's usually what we try to do when we go through boundaries. The second question on here is, will childcare options be considered? That childcare is not considered during a boundary change. Again, that would be through a COSA process, a change of school assignment. And again, you have to show some sort of hardship, but if you go online, search for the COSA process, you can learn more about that. Says, how do we know which streets are included in each zone? Again, I would recommend going to the interactive map, and that gives you the ability to zoom in and see more specifically where the individual schools are. You're also welcome to look at the zone map, that's the hard copy map over there, where the streets are more readable. That I read already. So, is there an option to do nothing? So, I would never say never. However, again, the idea here has been, this has been ongoing process since 2014-15, designed specifically to relieve crowding at Forest Knolls, and capital improvements are being done at the two different schools to relieve those the crowding at Forest Knolls. So the likelihood of doing nothing, I would say, is pretty slim.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Are there any plans for capital improvements here in Forest Knolls, or will this be kind of a standing issue?
So Forest Knolls, when they did the capacity analysis back in 14-15, they looked at the three schools, and it was determined that no addition could easily be built here, which is why the decision was made to put the additions at Montgomery, Knolls, and Pinecrest. So that decision was made already. And it has to do with site constraints and the current building not being able to go up in the current building because of the age of the building structure, et cetera. What is the street in the southern portion of Zone 5? It's not actually a street. The southern portion of Zone 5 is a lot line. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of schools, I believe. They are private schools, I believe, that are along there, and it's on the southern border of their lot line. Is there a weighting system that emphasizes variables over others, or are all equal? There is not a weighting system. So each of the factors, each of the four factors are considered equal. They're not saying one is more important to another. I used farms as an example because I just wanted to show you how to read the chart, but I could have used any one of those factors. This again is how will the district-wide study impact this? Not at all. It's a different study. Thank you. What is the rationale for option 2? And the rationale is, again, we have a limited number of pieces of geography to play with. So we were looking at permutations and combinations. As I indicated earlier, some of the options will do a better job with one of the factors versus another. So it's in that case, you look at it and say, well, geographically, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. What would have been worse would be to take options, or worse, different, to take some of the lower zones for Pinecrest, Montgomery Knolls, move them into Forest Knolls, and then move more out of Forest Knolls and move them in. So that would be an extreme example of geography gone awry, I'd say. But this was one of the options that was looked at. Will there be a study with regards to high schools? And does your office make any recommendations to the decision makers? So the high schools are not part of this study. So there will not be any recommendation or a study for that in this process. Our office does not do a recommendation. We do a presentation or a report to the superintendent. The superintendent actually, not, if I get this correctly, the superintendent will have a report that he will present to the board with his recommendation. So yes, we'll brief the superintendent on all of this data, but it is, staff is charged with providing a wide range of options, and as wide as you can, within reason. This, again, is not the same large piece of geography that the Upper County boundary study is, so the number of reasonable options is fewer. And does anyone else have a question? If they can raise, there we go. So are these three options the only three under consideration? At the moment, there's a possibility that between now and our next meeting, we might come up with another option. But at the moment, these are the three that are under consideration. Could the walk zones change? So the walk zones are determined by the Office of Transportation, and they are set. They are, the only thing that would change a walk zone would be the addition of sidewalks or crossing guards to make it a safe walk zone. But those are pretty well defined. The other thing is that there are certain streets that are deemed too dangerous for our students to cross. So there's nothing that's going to get a student across 495, for example. So that's a hard boundary. So there's the racial and ethnic numbers do change with every single one of these options. However, the students in Montgomery County Public Schools are treated equally regardless of what their background is. So that is not by itself something that's going to influence one way or another. Those are numbers that we track. Again, we're asked to look at demographics, but there's nothing negative about those numbers. And we should consider just the services that are needed to provide for the students that are in any one of our schools. And the services follow the students regardless of where they are located, where they live, based on their needs. So whether they have special needs or whether they have ESOL requirements or regardless, our students are equally treated. So the answer to how the factors are being considered is that demographics are considered as equal to utilization, as equal to, it is one of the, yes, demographics of the students is one of the factors that is considered at the same weight as utilization or stability or geography. Yes.
I just have a follow-up to that, because it seems like the three options, for the most part, at all the 5 schools, maybe with the exception of SSI, the statistical variance of the 5 demographics increases. So how exactly does the weighting work? Because I would think that...
There's no weighting.
So how does it work, basically? What's value about it?
So what you're seeing are percentages of students, if they were to move today, the percentage, the proportion of students. So the proportion of students in each of those categories. So we actually had this recently in a different study, and it was hard to understand because a large group was being moved from one school to the next, and it actually lowered all of their farms numbers, all 3 schools. And people said, how could that happen? But the fact is that they were moving out of one area, the higher farms area out of one school into another area, and they became the lower farms area for this other school. So it actually lowered each of their numbers. And that's just how math works. It's a proportion.
If each of the 5 was at the mean for all 5, then it would be perfectly diverse, right? All 5 would have equal weight, all 5 of the demographics. But it seems like they're getting, in most of these options, they get further from the mean and get more extreme. So in other words, the schools get less diverse, is what I'm interpreting most of these options. That's why I'm asking. It seems like if you just had one measure, which would be statistical variance, that was the thing we're looking at, then I think that might be there. That's why I'm trying to understand what is it that is the actual measure.
But it's just looking at the proportion of each. No, it's not eyeballing it. We're taking the current students and their race, ethnic, farms, ESOL data, and we're using that against the, if those students were moved today, what would the results be with the resulting enrollment? So getting the proportion of the students by each of those groups. So that's how it's technically calculated. It is tied to geography. It's in the zones, yes. Exactly. It's not equally distributed because it's by where they live. So that's how it's currently calculated. Yes?
If I could just ask you to review the summary chart, it looks to me, we were talking about the summary, but there's some errors in the specific lines in each one. Because they were not picked up from the previous meetings. So for example, the summary chart, if you look at Forest Knolls, there's no way that 28.7% of our kids are African American. And if you look back on the other pages, it'll indicate that 15.8% of our kids are African American, and that's much closer to reality.
So there might have been, and we'll get any corrections, we'll review it, and we'll get any corrections reposted, okay? Does anyone else have a card that they want? I want to thank everyone again for coming this evening. If you could turn in your pink slips, your pink sheets, that would be greatly appreciated. And see you at the next meeting, and hope you fill out the survey. Thank you very much.